Soldier's eyes told me everything before his mouth ever opened. He stood at the end of my driveway on day one, Corporal Reyes, according to the name tape stitched above his chest pocket, and he had that particular look people get when they've already made peace with something terrible. Not resignation, exactly. Something worse. The calm of a man who knows what's coming and has decided not to carry the weight of your ignorance alongside his own. "Sir, the convoy departs at 1400 hours, he said. "That gives you 90 minutes to gather essentials. 1 bag per person, 40 pounds maximum. Medical documentation if you have it." My sister Dara was on the porch behind me, arms crossed, watching. She'd driven in from Kellerton the night before when the cell network started dropping 3 hours through back roads because the interstate had apparently become something none of us had language for yet. She'd seen things on that drive she hadn't fully articulated. She kept starting sentences and stopping them. My neighbor Holt was already at the truck. He'd had his bag packed since the emergency alert the previous evening. 62 years old, former pipe fitter, a man who'd survived 3 layoffs and a house fire and a marriage that dissolved like wet paper. He moved toward that military vehicle with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that pride was a luxury you surrendered the moment survival became the agenda. "Joel," he called back toward me. "Come on, don't do this." I didn't answer him. I was still watching Reyes. "Where are you taking people?" I asked. "Relocation Point Alpha, north of Greenvale. Secured perimeter, medical triage, food distribution." "How far north?" "Approximately 60 miles. "And what happens to the people who don't go?" Reyes looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient who's just declined surgery. Professional, measured, practicing a neutrality that had clearly cost him something to develop. "That's a personal choice, sir. We strongly advise." "That's not what I asked." He held my gaze for a moment. Then, "We won't be returning to this district." That was the thing that should have moved me. A reasonable person hears those words, "We won't be returning," and they grab their 40 pounds and they climb into the truck. A reasonable person understands that this sentence is not a policy statement, but a eulogy for every choice they might make after it. I was not, at that moment, a reasonable person. I was a person standing in front of the house my father had built, where my mother had died in the back bedroom 3 years prior, where the garden she'd planted was still technically alive, in the late October cold, browning at the edges, but stubbornly rooted. I was a person who had spent 11 months working remotely, alone, developing a relationship with these walls and these rooms, and this specific quality of morning light through the east window that I could not adequately explain to a man with a rifle and a convoy schedule. I was also, if I'm being precise, a person who had not yet seen one. That changed 40 minutes later. Dara had gone inside to pack her things. Holt had already loaded his single bag. The convoy was still idling at the end of the block, a line of olive green vehicles that rumbled with the sound of institutional certainty. I was in the backyard, pulling the last of my mother's rosemary from the garden bed, which tells you everything you need to know about my psychological state, when I heard the sound from the Moretti property next door. Not a scream. Something before a scream. The intake of breath that precedes one. Then Mrs. Moretti's back door opened, and Mr. Moretti came through it, moving in a way that human bodies are not engineered to move. Head tilted, shoulders rolling forward with each step, like the architecture of his spine had been renegotiated by something that didn't understand load-bearing. He looked at me with eyes that had gone the color of old milk, and I finally understood what Reyes's expression had been telling me. I did not move for 4 seconds. I've counted them back in memory many times since, trying to locate the exact texture of that paralysis, whether it was fear or disbelief, or something more primitive that lives beneath both of those words. and has no clean name in English. 4 seconds is not a long time in any context, except this one. In this context, 4 seconds is a distance. It's the gap between a situation you can still exit and one that has already decided your options for you. Mr. Moretti, Frank Moretti, who had lent me his post-hole digger in August and complained about his knee through the entire transaction, covered half the yard in those 4 seconds. I threw the rosemary. I don't know why. There's a category of action that the body initiates when the mind is still loading the correct response protocol. And throwing the rosemary bundle was mine. It struck him in the chest. He didn't register it. He was 4 feet away when my legs finally rejoined the conversation, and I went sideways over the garden bed, catching my shin on the concrete edging and feeling the skin open. I hit the fence on the far side, grabbed the top rail, and pulled myself up with a desperation that briefly located muscles I'd forgotten I owned. I dropped into my own front yard, and sprinted toward the convoy. Reyes was still there, standing beside the lead vehicle. "There's one," I said. I was breathing badly. Next door, Frank Moretti. Something moved behind Reyes's professional composure, not surprise, but the acknowledgement that the conversation we'd been having had just shifted registers. He said something into his radio. 2 soldiers moved down the side alley between the houses. "Sir?" Reyes looked at me with careful precision. "The offer stands for another 40 minutes. My sister's inside." "Then I'd recommend retrieving her." Dara was in the kitchen when I came through the back door. She had a bag on the table, small, practical, already zipped. She looked at my leg, at the blood seeping into my sock, and then at my face, in the sequence of a person assembling a conclusion she'd already half drawn. "You saw one," she said. "Frank Moretti." She nodded slowly. She'd seen things on her drive from Kellerton. She'd been trying to tell me since she arrived. "How bad?" He was moving, functional, fast enough. "They're not slow, Joel. I tried to tell you. What people were saying online before the feeds went, they're not slow." This was new information delivered at the worst possible time. Every cultural assumption I'd imported into this situation, every film, every game, every piece of ambient cultural mythology about this particular category of catastrophe had told me slow, shambling. Manageable in the open if you kept your head. Dara's expression was doing the work of correcting an entire architecture of false preparation. I looked at her bag on the table. "You were ready to go." "I've been ready since last night." "Why didn't you push harder?" She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Because you were going to have to see it yourself. You were always going to have to see it yourself, Joel. You've always been like that." There was no cruelty in it, just the weary accuracy of someone who has known you long enough to have mapped your specific shape of stubbornness. I wanted to argue, and couldn't locate the material for it. "The convoy leaves in 38 minutes, I said. "I know." "Holt's already on." "I know that too." We stood in the kitchen of my father's house, and I looked at the east window and the specific quality of light I'd told myself I couldn't surrender. And I understood, or believed I understood, that some form of courage required staying. That leaving was the easy architecture. That there was something worth protecting here beyond my own continuity. I was wrong about this, but the wrongness had a shape I couldn't see yet. "Go," I told her. "Get on the convoy." "Joel, I mean it. I'm staying. You go." The silence between us lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then she picked up her bag, and she kissed me on the forehead the way our mother used to when one of us was sick, and she walked out the front door. Day 1 ended without incident. which was its own particular form of damage. I'd expected the night to deliver something definitive, a siege, a clear threat that would either vindicate my choice or punish it with enough immediacy to constitute a lesson. Instead, the darkness settled over the neighborhood the way darkness always had, except without the peripheral glow of other houses' televisions, without the occasional headlights sweeping down Birch Street, without the distant sound of Holt's generator that had been a fixture of the soundscape since the previous winter. Silence is not neutral. Most people don't understand this until silence arrives at the wrong time and reveals itself as a pressure system. I'd inventoried the house by 5 p.m. Canned goods sufficient for approximately 3 weeks at conservative consumption. A propane camping stove with 2 full canisters. Rain catchment possible from the downspout if I modified the barrel my father had left in the garage. First aid supplies that were adequate for minor injuries and inadequate for anything serious. 2 flashlights, 1 headlamp, 11 batteries in various states of charge. A hunting knife I'd never used for hunting. A camp axe. No firearm because I'd never owned one. Because the version of myself that had existed before 1400 hours on day 1 had lived in a world where this felt like a reasonable omission. I slept in the living room with a camp axe beside me and the couch pushed against the front door. Sleep arrived in 30-minute fragments, each one ending when some small sound from the street initiated a sequence of cortisol response that sat me upright before I'd fully transitioned from unconscious to awake. By 3 a.m., I'd abandoned the project entirely and sat by the east window watching the street in the dark. Nothing came. By morning, I'd started to reconstruct a justification. The convoy had spooked people. Mass evacuation creates its own panic gradient, its own collateral damage. Staying still, remaining in a known environment with known resources, this was defensible. Strategic, even. I'd read enough about disaster response to know that not all official directives were optimized for individual circumstances. The military was managing a population. I was managing one person. Different calculus. This is the story I was telling myself when Marcus Vale knocked on my back door at 7:15 a.m. I didn't know his name yet. I knew him as the man who'd moved into the rental on Aldrich Street 2 months prior. I'd seen him exactly 3 times. In the way you see neighbors without actually encountering them. Driveway appearances, window adjacency, the brief visual transaction at the recycling bins. Early 30s. Drove a silver compact. That was the entire file. He looked substantially worse than he had in any of those peripheral sightings. His jacket was torn along one shoulder. He had a gash across his left forearm that he'd wrapped in what appeared to be a kitchen towel, tied with one of those metal twist ties from a bread bag, which was either resourceful or a sign that his supplies were already more depleted than mine. "You stayed," he said, less surprise than recognition. "Apparently. I saw your light on last night." He nodded toward the east window. "I'm Marcus. I live on Aldrich. I know." He let out a breath that was partly relief and partly something older and more complicated. The particular exhale of a person who has spent the night alone with a bad decision and is grateful to discover they're not the only one. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Me too." He looked at my arm. No. At the camp axe I was still holding. He tracked it without comment, which told me he'd already recalibrated what registered as threatening versus merely cautious. "I don't want to impose. I saw the light, and I thought." "Come in," I said. This was the first purely instinctive decision I made in the outbreak. And unlike the decision to stay, I never found a reason to regret it. Marcus had been a high school history teacher before the outbreak, 10th and 11th grade, American and world history, which I mention not because it's decorative, but because it shaped everything about how he processed what was happening. He had a habit, I would learn, of reaching for historical parallel, the way some people reach for religious framework. Not to minimize the present, but to locate it, to find it on a map that had coordinates. He'd also, unlike me, actually seen the evacuation happen rather than just watch the convoy idle and leave. He'd been 4 blocks away when the secondary convoy there had been multiple. Staggert had encountered a cluster of infected near the intersection of Birch and Carmody. He described what he'd seen in the careful, deliberate language of someone who understood that the words needed to be accurate and also survivable. There were 7 of them, he said, that I could count. Moving fast, not running, but purposeful, like they knew the geometry of the space. He paused. I've been trying to figure out what I mean by that. They moved like they understood angles. Angles. Flanking almost. Without coordination, there wasn't a signal or a leader, but they spread out instinctively, or whatever the word is for instinct in that condition. He looked at his tea. I'd made tea from a box in the cabinet, which felt absurdly domestic and was also exactly what both of us needed. The soldiers handled it, but there were more people left behind than I think anyone officially planned for. I thought about Reyes's expression. The pre-made peace. How many people do you think stayed? In this immediate neighborhood? Counting the 2 of us, I've seen 4 others. Old couple on Ferris Lane. They watched the convoy leave from their porch and didn't move. Young woman, late 20s maybe. She was arguing with a soldier, and then the truck left, and she was just standing there. And then there's the man. What man? Marcus wrapped his hands around his mug. 3 houses north of you. I don't know him, but he's been organized since yesterday morning. He's the reason I know which houses have been cleared. I looked at Marcus. Cleared? He put marks on the doors, paint, a system. He met my eyes. He's been working this block since before the convoy left. I sat with this information. Someone with a system. Someone who had been moving through the neighborhood with paint and a method while I was pulling rosemary from a garden bed, and Reyes was measuring me with his professional neutrality. This meant either competence or a specific kind of danger, and I didn't yet have the data to separate those possibilities. Did you talk to him? I asked. Briefly. His name is Garrett Cross. He was a paramedic. Marcus looked at his tea. He said the convoy wasn't going where they said it was going. The sentence landed in the kitchen with a weight that made the ambient silence repressurize. How would he know that? He had a scanner. Emergency frequencies. Said he heard a transmission. What kind of transmission? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, something moved in the street, just a sound. Just the particular percussion of weight on asphalt. And we both went still until it passed. An animal, probably. Or wind-displaced debris. Or the specific perversity of a world in which every ambient sound had been retroactively categorized as potential threat. He said the transmission was a facility lockdown order. Marcus finally answered. Destination sealed. Nobody in or out once the convoy arrived. I thought about Dara. About Holt with his single-packed bag and his pipe fitter's efficiency. About the 40 pounds maximum and the medical documentation. I thought about Reyes's voice when he'd said we won't be returning to this district. And how I'd interpreted that as a statement about the military's plans, not about the destination's permanence. That could mean a lot of things, I said, because I needed it to. Yes, Marcus said. It could. Neither of us said what we were both calculating. Garrett Cross was not what I expected, which is the most inadequate way I know to describe him. I expected someone large, someone whose competence would read physically. the way movie protagonists carry their capability in their shoulders and their jaw. Cross was medium height, slight, with the kind of economical build that comes from spending years in environments where size creates problems instead of solving them. He had very steady hands and very direct eye contact and a way of speaking that compressed information into its minimum viable form without losing precision. He'd been a paramedic for 9 years. Before that, 2 years in the National Guard, which he mentioned not as a credential, but as context when explaining why he'd had the scanner and why he knew how to read what he heard on it. His house was a lesson in useful contrast to mine. He'd been preparing since the first emergency alerts, not in the prepper mythology sense, not with an ideology or a manifesto, but with the methodical focus of a man who dealt professionally with the gap between what people assumed safety looked like and what it actually required. He had water in every available container. He had a secondary exit from every room he spent significant time in. He had a map of the neighborhood on his kitchen table, marked in a system of symbols I needed him to explain. Red X means confirmed infected inside, he said. Blue circle means cleared, unoccupied. Yellow circle means occupied by survivors. He pointed. That's your house. This is mine. Marcus is here. 3 yellow circles in a 5-block radius. What about the couple on Ferris? Marcus asked. He'd come with me, which had felt like the right configuration, not for safety, exactly, but because neither of us was prepared to navigate Garrett Cross's particular gravity alone on first contact. Ferris Lane is 4 blocks out of my operational range, Cross said. He said operational range without self-consciousness, as a practical term rather than a performed one. I'll extend the survey today. The woman who missed the convoy, I said. Late 20s, you mentioned. Cross pointed to a mark I hadn't noticed, a small diamond, different from the other symbols. Found her yesterday evening. House on Carmody. Name's Priya. Priya Segal. She was a nurse. Was? Is, he corrected. Medical training, present tense. I said it wrong. He didn't apologize, just corrected and moved on. She's been treating her own hand. Minor bite from before she reached the house, from a broken window she went through. Not infected. The bite is from the glass, not from... He stopped. She's clear. I've been monitoring. The word bite sat in the room like a physical object we all had to arrange ourselves around. You're monitoring her, Marcus said. Someone has to. Cross looked at both of us with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely unwilling to accommodate sentimentality as a navigational tool. This is not a criticism of either of you. You're both here, you're both functional. You both made choices that landed you in a survivable position. That means you're assets. I'd like to operate as a group, structured, with clear roles based on actual capability. A pause. That's a proposal, not a directive. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. There was entire conversation in that look about competence and control, about the specific discomfort of following someone you didn't know because they were manifestly better at something you couldn't afford to be bad at. What roles? I asked. Segal manages medical. Marcus, you're on information documentation, tracking what we know and don't know, mapping patterns. You're a teacher. You understand how to organize knowledge. And me? I asked. Cross looked at me with that direct, economical gaze. You're good with structures. I watched you reinforce your back fence yesterday. He said it without explanation of how he'd been watching, which implied he'd been surveilling the block longer and more systematically than any of us had registered. Engineering problems. I'll need someone who can think spatially about this neighborhood. It was the most accurate assessment anyone had offered of me in years, delivered by a man I'd known for 11 minutes. All right, I said. Day 2 introduced us to the specific cruelty of false normalcy. The morning was quiet in a way that felt structurally different from the silence of Day 1. Not the silence of evacuation aftermath, but the silence of a neighborhood that had reached some kind of provisional equilibrium. Birds returned to the Moretti yard, which disturbed me in a way I couldn't initially account for, until I understood it was because their presence implied the absence of active threat in that immediate area, which in turn implied that whatever Mr. Moretti had been before Cross's survey had accounted for him was no longer there. Cross had cleared 9 houses before the convoy left. In the map's notation system, this had given me a false sense of the surrounding territory. The yellow circles of our small group sat inside a much larger field of red marks and question marks. And the question marks were, in Cross's view, more dangerous than the red. Unknown is always the primary threat. He said at the morning meeting he'd established a daily 8 a.m. gathering at his kitchen table, which felt militaristic until you recognized that structure was the only thing preventing each of us from spending the day in individual spirals of unproductive fear. We know how to respond to confirmed infected. We don't know how to respond to houses we haven't assessed. Priya Sehgal had joined us by Day 2. She was compact and precise, and moved with a nurse's fluency in confined spaces. The practiced economy of someone trained to work around other people's bodies without causing additional harm. Her hand was wrapped in proper dressing. She kept it elevated with a discipline that told me she'd given the same instruction to patients too many times to allow herself the hypocrisy of ignoring it. She had also, it turned out, known Garrett Cross before the outbreak. Not well, they'd crossed paths at the county hospital, which was technically his operational territory as a paramedic. But they had a shared professional language that occasionally excluded Marcus and me. Not unkindly, but practically. The shorthand of people who'd spent years communicating under urgency. "The bite," Marcus said to me, quietly on the porch after the meeting. "Cross said he's monitoring." He is. But he also said not infected with a confidence level that I'm not sure. She's a nurse, Marcus. She knows what she's looking for. She's the one being monitored. That's a conflict of interest. I looked at him. He wasn't being cruel. He was doing what he described as his role information, documentation, tracking what was known and unknown. He was being precise, which was not the same as being unkind. "Talk to Cross," I said. I did. He agrees with me. He's monitoring her, not relying on her self-report. He just didn't say it that way in front of her. I thought about this, about the ethical texture of a situation in which the correct approach was functionally deceptive, and also probably the only approach that kept Priya functional and therefore useful and therefore safer for all of us. The outbreak had been open for less than 36 hours, and already the moral architecture was developing complications I hadn't anticipated. "She's clear," I said finally. "She'll stay clear. And if she doesn't, Cross has a protocol." "Does he?" "Yes." Marcus said it the way you say something when the information is accurate and also heavy enough that you'd prefer not to have had to learn it. We didn't discuss the protocol further that day. What we did instead was begin the expansion survey, Cross and I moving through the adjacent block while Marcus and Priya worked on the supply consolidation he'd outlined. Cross moved through the neighborhood with a fluid economy that I tried to emulate without fully succeeding. He checked sight lines before turning corners. He listened at doors rather than knocking immediately. He developed a series of nonverbal signals during his solo survey that he transmitted to me quickly, and that I absorbed with the focused attention of a man who understood that misreading them could be immediately consequential. The Henderson house on Maple was our 7th stop. Cross's painted mark on the door indicated a question status from the previous day. He listened, signaled clear, reached for the door handle. It was unlocked. It swung inward. And inside, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and a Bible open to a page I couldn't read at distance, was a woman who appeared to be in her late 70s, watching us enter her house with the patient dignity of someone who had decided to wait and see what arrived next. "I wondered when someone would check on me," she said. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She'd been a librarian for 34 years. Eleanor Marsh was not a complication. I want to be precise about this, because my first instinct, and I'm not proud of it, but I'm committed to accuracy, was to calculate her in terms of the group's resource equation. Age, mobility, medical requirements, contribution capacity. The mental spreadsheet of crisis that dehumanizes people into variables. Cross shut down that calculation in my head simply by the way he sat across from her at her kitchen table and talked to her as if time were not a factor and she were not a variable. It was a thing I watched him do and tried to understand the mechanism of, and eventually concluded it wasn't a mechanism at all. It was just that he actually believed she was worth the time, and that belief expressed itself naturally. Eleanor had a cup cabinet full of food, a quirk of her organizational system that had turned out to be accidentally survivable. She'd been cooking and storing in containers for the past 3 days, quietly, without panic, the way she'd apparently done everything for the past 7 decades. She had 2 prescription medications that were not immediately critical, but would become so within the month. She had a battery radio and had been listening to the emergency broadcasts until they went silent the previous afternoon. "They stopped at 3:47 p.m., she said. I noted the time. She folded her hands on the Bible's open pages. The last transmission said the Greenvale facility was at capacity and that additional convoys had been redirected to a secondary site. Secondary site. I looked at Cross. He'd gone very still in the way that meant he was processing something he'd already half suspected. "Did they say where?" he asked. "They said the location was classified for security purposes." She looked at him with clear, unperturbed eyes. "That's what they say when they don't intend to tell you." Marcus, when I reported this at the evening meeting, went quiet for a long moment. Then he said what the rest of us had been assembling in private. "If the facility is sealed and they've redirected convoys to an undisclosed location, Dara and Holt might not be where we think they are." I'd been not thinking this since Marcus first mentioned the scanner transmission. I'd been storing it in a part of my mind I'd cordoned off because I needed to function, and because I had no actionable response to the anxiety. And because Dara had walked out that door with her practical bag and the forehead kiss. And I had to believe she was somewhere with food and medical care and institutional walls between her and the specific horror that had moved through Frank Moretti's joints. "They're alive," I said. Marcus didn't challenge it. Neither did Cross, which was the most useful thing he could have done. "Priya," Cross said, shifting the way he shifted when he'd allowed enough time for an emotional moment, and was now returning to operational reality, which was a quality I had started to grudgingly appreciate. "I want to relocate Eleanor here by tomorrow. Her medications need to be in a central location." "I can set up a basic dispensing schedule," Priya said. "Joel, I need you to look at the Marsh house's structural connections to the adjacent properties. I want to understand the roof access." I looked at him. "We're thinking about roof movement." "I'm thinking about all movement. Ground level is going to become progressively less viable." He spread the neighborhood map on the table. We have 5 people in a 4-block radius with enough consolidated supplies to sustain us for approximately 3 weeks at current consumption. That's the foundation. What I want to build on it is a connected space strategy movement above ground level, wherever the architecture permits. He pointed to the map, to my house, to the east window and the specific quality of morning light. Your father built well, he said. The roof line is high and it's connected on the north side to the Moretti property by about 18 inches of clearance at the peak, which isn't enough, normally. But there's a trellis system on the west face that... I know the trellis, I said. Can you fix it to bear weight? I thought of my father's hands, of the way he'd built things to last, methodically, testing each joint before moving to the next. Yes. How long? Half a day, with the right materials. We have the materials. In the Moretti garage. He looked at me. You'll need to go through their yard. The memory of Frank Moretti's eyes, the old milk color, the renegotiated architecture of his movement moved through me and settled. Tomorrow morning, I said. I'll go tomorrow morning. The Moretti garage was across 20 feet of open yard, and those 20 feet were the longest I'd navigated since the outbreak. Cross covered me from the fence line he'd acquired, from the house on Carmody he'd surveyed the previous day. A crossbow that he handled with the competent ease of a man who'd clearly trained with one at some point and was disinclined to explain when or why. Marcus stayed at the east window of my house, watching the street. Priya was with Eleanor. The yard was empty. I crossed it in 10 seconds, staying low by habit rather than strategy, since there was no cover between the fence and the garage that would have made low any more effective than upright. The garage side door was unlocked. The interior was organized with a kind of ordered competence that told me Frank Moretti had been a man who valued his tools. The trellis brackets were on the 3rd shelf on the right wall. Heavy gauge aluminum, lag bolts still in the bag. The kind of mounting hardware that was meant for pergola construction and would hold substantially more weight than I'd need it to. I loaded them into a canvas bag I'd brought, along with a drill and a box of additional fasteners. I was on my way back to the door when I heard it. Interior sound. Rhythmic. The specific cadence of something that was not quite footsteps, but was organized in the same frequency range. A heavy, recurring contact against a hard surface. Coming from the door that connected the garage to the house's interior. I stopped moving. The sound continued. Patient. Mechanical almost, in its repetition. Frank Moretti, or what Frank Moretti had become, was on the other side of that door. Drawn, presumably, by the sound of my movement in the garage, by the biological signal of a living person in proximity. I watched the door handle. It was an interior knob, the kind with a simple twist mechanism. The question that occupied approximately 3 of the longest seconds of my life was whether what was on the other side of that door retained enough motor function to operate it. The handle didn't move. I walked backward to the side exit, slowly, not breaking my gaze from the connecting door. And I let myself out into the yard and crossed back to the fence. And Cross put his hand on my shoulder when I reached him, not saying anything, which was exactly the right response. I built the trellis reinforcement that afternoon with hands that were steadier than I would have predicted. At 4 p.m., while I was 3 rungs up the modified trellis testing the upper bracket's load rating, Marcus called up from below, "The radio's got something." I climbed down. We gathered around the battery radio in Eleanor's kitchen, all 5 of us, in the particular proximity that a small group develops when they've begun to trust each other by necessity, and have started to suspect it might be becoming something more than that. The transmission was military frequency, scratchy with static and distance. A voice reading coordinates and status codes that Cross could partially parse and the rest of us couldn't. He listened with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the table. When it ended, he was quiet for a moment. "The secondary site," he said. "I got a partial coordinate. It's not north of Greenvale." "Where is it?" Priya asked. "East. 70, maybe 80 miles. He opened his eyes. "The direction that goes through the Outbreak's densest mapped zone." I thought about Dara in a convoy truck, moving east through the densest mapped zone. "They would have had military escort," Marcus said, because he was reading my face. "Yes," Cross said. We all understood that military escort and safety were no longer synonymous terms, and none of us said so. And the not saying was its own form of care. Day 3 arrived with a sound I hadn't heard since the outbreak began. Rain. It started before dawn, a soft, steady percussion on the roof that was so ordinary, so completely disconnected from the new grammar of our days, that I lay on the living room floor for several minutes, simply registering it. Rain meant water catchment. Rain meant reduced visibility, which was both a defensive complication and, Cross argued at the morning meeting, a potential operational advantage. Rain also meant that the infected on the block moved differently. We'd observed this through the morning, 3 confirmed infected on Birch Street, visible from the upper window Marcus had designated his observation post, all 3 of them moving with less directional coherence than the patterns we'd cataloged in the previous 48 hours. Not slower exactly, more erratic. Something about the rain disturbed whatever sensory system they were navigating by. Cross had a theory. He presented it with appropriate uncertainty, which was one of the things I'd come to rely on. About him, he was never overconfident about things he didn't know. "Olfactory disruption," he said. "They may orient significantly by smell. Rain would diffuse scent trails, create false signals. It's not confirmed, but the behavioral data is consistent." This was new, and it was important. "If we move during rain," Priya said, "we have a window." A small one, and inconsistent. Cross looked at the map. But yes. What Cross wanted to move was Eleanor's medications. The pharmacy 4 blocks east, technically the wrong direction given the coordinate information, but close enough that he'd assessed it as the first necessary risk. The medications were time-sensitive enough that the window of 3 weeks I'd been calculating needed a supplement. Priya had been specific. 2 of Eleanor's prescriptions became critical within 18 days. Cross had been specific in return. 18 days was not enough time to assume conditions would improve sufficiently to make the pharmacy accessible under better terms. Marcus had objections. He raised them methodically, the way he processed most things, not reactively, but organized into a coherent argument that deserved engagement. The route had 2 known infected on the direct path. The pharmacy had question mark status, meaning its interior was unassessed. Cross would be covering, which meant the medical expertise moved with the risk rather than remaining at base and reserve. The rain was not guaranteed to hold. All of this was accurate. Cross's response was also accurate. Inaction was not neutral. Every day we waited was a day closer to a pharmaceutical emergency in a context where pharmaceuticals could not be manufactured, could not be traded for, could not be improvised. Eleanor's cardiac medication was not a comfort item. We voted. It was the first time we'd voted on anything, which Marcus noted was itself a decision about group structure. Cross received it with a small nod that suggested he'd expected we'd need this mechanism eventually, and had prepared himself to accept its outcomes. 4-1 in favor of the pharmacy run. Marcus voted against, logged his objection, and then immediately began helping plan the route. This was, I realized, what actual integrity looked like in practice. Cross and I went. Priya stayed with Eleanor. Marcus stayed at the window, tracking the 3 infected on Birch through binoculars he'd salvaged from the Henderson house. The rain was the right kind, steady enough to matter, not hard enough to obscure our footing. We moved in the pattern Cross had developed through 2 days of solo survey. Staggered spacing, stop-listen intervals at each corner, hand signals for hold, clear, threat, and fall back. The 2 infected on the direct route were near a car wreck at the intersection of Carmody and 2nd, a cluster point, Cross had noted, where they seemed to return repeatedly, which implied some form of territorial or habitual behavior that was worth understanding and also immediately unsettling to consider. We went wide, through the alley behind the Delgado property, adding 4 minutes to the route. The pharmacy's rear entrance was unlocked. The interior was dark and smelled of chemical cold storage, losing its battle with ambient temperature. We were in and moving through the aisles before my eyes fully adjusted. Cross navigating by the small penlight he kept clipped to his jacket, reading labels with the speed of someone who'd spent years doing exactly this, in worse light, under worse conditions. We found Eleanor's prescriptions. We found several others that Cross assessed as strategically valuable: antibiotics, specific analgesics, 2 items Priya had asked for on the basis of what she called reasonable probability planning, which was her phrase for anticipating the kinds of injuries the next month was likely to generate. We were 5 minutes from exit when the back door opened behind us. The man who came through the pharmacy's rear entrance was not infected. He was, however, armed, a fact established immediately by the flashlight in his left hand and the hunting rifle in his right, both of which he'd oriented toward us before either of us fully processed the transition from the sound of the door to the presence of a new variable in the room. "Hands," he said. Flat voice, not panicked, which was in some ways more concerning than panic, because panic suggests an elevated threshold, a point past which rational behavior reasserts itself. This man's flatness suggested he was already past that threshold by some distance. Cross raised his hands at a measured pace. I followed. The crossbow was on his back, positioned there rather than in his hands, because we'd agreed that hand-carrying it while gathering supplies created more problems than it solved, or a calculation I was now retroactively revising. "We're survivors," Cross said. "We have a small group 4 blocks west. We came for medications." The man's flashlight moved over us in the slow, assessing sweep of someone who was doing risk calculation in real time. He was, I estimated, mid-50s. Work clothes, not military or tactical. A beard that had been developing for at least 2 weeks, which meant he'd been preparing or isolated longer than most. His hands were steady, which was the thing I kept returning to, because steady hands on a weapon mean a different type of problem than unsteady ones. "How many in your group?" he asked. Cross gave him the number without hesitation. I understood the logic withholding information from an armed man in a pharmacy in a rainstorm creates a problem. Sharing it creates a smaller one, potentially. 5, Cross said. 2 with medical backgrounds. We have consolidated supplies and a secured location. One of them elderly. Cross paused. A small pause, measured. "How do you know that?" I asked. "I've been watching your block since yesterday." He lowered the rifle, not fully, not in the gesture of a man who'd made a decision, but partially, in the gesture of a man who was willing to proceed to the next exchange before making one. "My name is Cutter. That's not a nickname, it's a family name. I know it's not helpful right now." A pause. "I was a county sheriff's deputy for 19 years. The information landed in the room and rearranged several things. You've been watching our block," Cross said. "I've been watching the whole district. There are more survivors than you know. You've been working your 4-block radius. I've been working 12. He looked at Cross directly. You have a system. I've seen the marks. It's a good system. How many? 11 besides your 5, scattered. Some of them in bad positions. He finally lowered the rifle to a carry position pointed at the floor, not at either of us. I've been trying to find someone with enough organizational capacity to work with. I found you instead. Cross processed this without visible reaction for a moment. Then something very close to amusement moved across his face the first time I'd seen that register on him, which made it notable. 11 people, he said. 11 that I've confirmed. There may be more I haven't reached. What do you need from us? Coordination, medical, and someone who can do what you've been doing with the map, but at a scale that actually corresponds to the problem. He looked between us. We're not surviving 4 blocks. Nobody's surviving 4 blocks. The question is whether 16 people can survive 40. I thought about what 40 blocks looked like, about the question marks on Cross's map, and how they multiplied as you moved outward, red marks and question marks in an expanding field. Yellow circles thinly scattered. Our small group of 5 suddenly understanding ourselves as a nucleus rather than a totality. Come back with us, Cross said. Meet the group. Cutter nodded. He moved to the door he'd come through, looked out into the rain, then back. You came in the back? Yes. I'll take you out the front. I know a clear path. He did. He navigated us through 4 blocks of rain-washed street with the quiet authority of a man who'd walked dangerous terrain long enough to have internalized the geometry of threat. We reached Cross's house in 11 minutes. He hadn't consulted a map once. Marcus saw him from the window before we arrived. By the time we reached the front door, Marcus had clearly run a rapid briefing for Priya and Eleanor, because they were all in the kitchen, and the kitchen had the feeling of a room where people had just stopped having a tense conversation. Cutter stepped inside, looked at the map on Cross's table, and said, You're missing 14 streets on the northeast quadrant. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and spread it next to ours. His was more complete. Day 4 began before I was ready for it, which was, I was learning, the defining characteristic of days inside the outbreak. Cutter had stayed overnight, not sleeping exactly, but occupying the armchair in Cross's front room in the way of someone who'd learned to restore himself without fully surrendering consciousness. By 5 a.m., he was at the table with a cup of coffee from Cross's dwindling supply and his map, and a list he'd been adding to in the small hours. Survivor names, locations, needs, and in a column I didn't understand, at first a status code that I eventually recognized as his assessment of each person's psychological stability. You're triaging mental state, I said. I've been doing it since day 1. He looked up. The physical threats are manageable if you're mentally coherent. The mental threats are what actually collapse groups. Cross arrived at the table, saw the column, nodded. This was apparently an idea he'd also held and hadn't yet formalized into notation. The morning meeting was different with 6 people. The dynamics shifted in ways both obvious and subtle. Cutter's authority was different from Cross's, older and more institutional, carrying the specific weight of 19 years of decisions made in public on behalf of others. Cross's authority was procedural and technical. The 2 of them could have created a conflict that broke the group along a fault line of competing competence. Instead, they reached a working arrangement in approximately 40 minutes of structured conversation that Marcus and I mostly observed, and Priya and Eleanor participated in, with the practical clarity of people who understood that the political question was less important than the outcome. Cross would continue to lead operational planning for their immediate area. Cutter would function as the connection point for the wider survivor network, the 13 people in his 12-block survey. Medical decisions would be Priya's. Information management would be Marcus's. Eleanor, who had listened to all of this with her folded hands and her librarian's patience, would manage what Cutter called institutional memory, the documentation of what they knew, what they'd done, what had failed and what hadn't, because she was organized, she was attentive, and she was, in her own words, not going anywhere and might as well be useful. It was the most functional thing I'd seen humans construct since the outbreak began. I want to be clear about something. This functionality did not feel triumphant. It felt necessary in the way that breathing is necessary, not inspiring, just the minimum condition for continuation. We were not a team forged by adversity into something better than our component parts. We were 5 people, now 6, trying to avoid the specific category of death that was mobile and systematic in its spread and making sounds against the interior doors of garages at night. The functionality was not a virtue. It was an adaptation. At 9 a.m., Cutter said, "I need to tell you what I know about the evacuation." The room went still. He'd been a deputy. He'd had contact with the County Emergency Management Office through the first day. He'd been on duty when the initial alerts went out, had participated in the early response before the situation outpaced the response infrastructure. He'd made a choice to stay not from stubbornness or sentiment, but from a specific piece of information that his emergency management contact had conveyed before communications collapsed. "The Greenvale facility," he said. "Relocation Point Alpha. It was designed for 4,000 occupants. The convoy system brought approximately 11,000 in the first 18 hours. I watched him say this. Watched him say it the way he said everything, flat, factual, without melodrama, because melodrama was a luxury, and also because the facts themselves were sufficiently dramatic. "The secondary site," Cross said, "doesn't exist as a fixed facility. It was a contingency term for managed dispersal, which means the military was authorized to redirect convoys to any location they assessed as viable in the moment." He folded his hands on the table, a gesture that reminded me unexpectedly of Eleanor. "The people on those convoys are in improvised shelters, multiple locations. Some of them are fine. Some of them—" He stopped. "Some of them aren't," Marcus said quietly. "Probably. We don't know. We can't know." He looked at me specifically. I told him about Dara the previous evening. "We can't know, Joel. Which means we work with what we can affect." I understood, in that moment, why Reyes had been looking at me the way he had. It wasn't the peace of a man who knew something terrible was coming. It was the peace of a man who knew that the terrible thing had already begun, and that his job was to keep moving people away from its center, regardless of where the center turned out to be. I'd refused his offer. Dara had accepted it. I couldn't know, sitting at Cross's kitchen table on day 4, whether I'd made the correct choice or the catastrophic one. The absence of that certainty was its own specific weight, and I was learning to carry it. The decision that fractured us came from an unexpected source. By midday on day 4, the group dynamics had begun to reveal their stress points, not through conflict exactly, but through the differential between what people were willing to do and what the situation was requiring. Cross and Cutter were aligned on the fundamental logic of expansion. The group could not remain static. The resources of the immediate area would deplete. The survivor network needed physical consolidation. Marcus agreed intellectually. Priya agreed practically. Eleanor agreed with the equanimity of someone who had survived enough of life's reorganizations to find another one merely interesting. I was the fracture point, The plan Cross and Cutter had developed through the morning involved relocating 3 of Cutter's 11 survivor contacts to our block within 48 hours. One of these contacts was a man named Brennan, late 40s, former logistics manager, physically capable, psychologically stable per Cutter's assessment. One was a teenager named Amara, 17 years old, who'd been alone in her family's house since day one. Her family had been on the convoy. And one was a man named Pollard, who had been until the outbreak, a secondary school vice principal, and who presented, per Cutter's notes, with what Cutter called functional paranoia, meaning his anxiety responses were elevated and potentially disruptive, but had not yet produced irrational behavior. The logistics of the relocation were technically solvable. Cross had mapped the routes. Cutter knew the timing windows. The rain had created a workable behavioral pattern in the infected on the primary route. The fracture was not logistical. It was about Amara. She was 17. She was alone. She'd been alone for 3 days. These facts were not debatable, and their emotional weight was immediate and uniform across the group. We were all, without discussion, resolved to get her out of that house. But Cutter had also noted in the psychological stability column in his careful deputy's notation that she had a dog, a large one, a German shepherd named something she'd referenced, but he hadn't caught. The dog changed the calculus, not because any of us objected to the dog in principle, but because a dog in the current environment was a risk variable with a specific shape. Noise, scent, behavioral unpredictability when stressed. Cross laid this out not as a prohibition, but as a data point that needed to be factored into the route planning. Amara, per Cutter's brief contact with her, had been explicit. The dog came, or she stayed. The room processed this in silence. "She's 17, Priya said finally. The statement required no elaboration. It was a complete argument. "The dog creates a real threat to the route," Cross said, not to contradict Priya, to be accurate. "Can we modify the route?" Marcus asked. "We can add 12 minutes to avoid the main cluster point," Cross said. 12 minutes in the rain window is marginal. I'd been quiet through this. Then I said, "I'll bring her. Just me and Cutter. Separately from the Brennan and Pollard retrieval. Different timing." "That splits our coverage," Cross said. "Yes." I looked at him. "I'm the one with the spatial assessment role. The route to her street goes past the Moretti property, past the trellis work, through the alley I know better than anyone else here. I know that path. I can run it with Cutter in 8 minutes with the dog if the dog is handled properly." "Can you handle a shepherd?" Cutter asked. "My father had one for 12 years, yes." Cross looked at me for a long moment, then at the map, then back. 8 minutes is inside the window if the rain holds. "The rain will hold," Eleanor said from her chair by the window. She'd been watching the sky with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades of her life in buildings without climate control and had developed a reliable relationship with weather. "At least another 2 hours." Cross looked at her, nodded. 8 minutes, he said. "Go." Her name was Amara Osei, and she was the most composed 17-year-old I'd ever encountered, or possibly the best performing one. I couldn't immediately determine which, and ultimately concluded it was neither. That she was simply a person who'd been alone for 72 hours with genuine danger and genuine responsibility, and had organized herself around both with a maturity that had nothing to do with precocity and everything to do with necessity. The dog was named Atlas. He was approximately 90 pounds of controlled attention, not aggressive, but intensely present, reading the room with the systematic focus of a working breed, doing what it was built to do. When Cutter and I came through the back door Amara had left unlocked per his instructions, Atlas stood and assessed us without barking, which was immediately the most tactically significant thing that happened in those first 30 seconds. Amara was packed. One bag, appropriately sized, food included. She'd thought to pack food for Atlas from the remaining supply, which told me she'd done the resource calculation already. She looked at us the way teenagers rarely look at adults they've just met. Directly, without performing affect in either direction, with a clear assessment operating behind her eyes. "You're Joel," she said. Cutter had apparently described us in their brief communication. "Yes. You know dogs." "I do." She looked at Atlas, then at me. Something transferred in that look, not a transfer of authority, exactly, but of responsibility. She was telling me that she trusted me with the things she'd structured her survival around for 3 days. I understood what that meant, and accepted it with the seriousness it deserved. We moved out through the yard in 40 seconds. Cutter first, reading the alley. Amara middle, hand resting on Atlas's back. Not a restraint, a communication. Me behind, watching their 6. Atlas moved alongside Amara with the fluid quiet of a dog who'd been trained and who trusted the person on the other end of his attention. The alley route took us past the back of the Moretti property. I kept my eyes forward. The garage door was closed. No sound from inside. We were 2 minutes from Cross's block when Atlas stopped. He didn't alert, no bark, no raised hackles in the way I'd expected. He simply stopped and shifted his orientation 45 degrees to the left, toward the gap between the Henderson house and the property behind it, and stood with his whole body focused and still. Cutter saw it. He raised his fist halt, and we stopped. 15 seconds of silence. The rain falling. Nothing visible in the gap. Then Atlas exhaled through his nose a slow, deliberate breath, and turned back to his forward orientation, and looked at Amara as if awaiting for instruction. We moved. I didn't know what had been in that gap. I still don't, fully. But Atlas's behavioral response had been specific in a way that Cross's theory about olfactory disruption suddenly illuminated. The infected were navigating by smell, and Atlas was navigating in the same register. And the information he processed and the information they processed had briefly intersected. And he had assessed the situation and moved us through it before any of us, with human sensory limitations, had registered the threat. I thought about this for the remaining 4 minutes of the route. About the things we couldn't sense that the world was full of. About decisions made without access to complete information. And how that was not a failure condition, but a permanent state. We reached Cross's house and came through the back door, and Priya's expression, when she saw all 3 of us and Atlas, was the first thing in 4 days that made my chest physically loosen. Atlas walked to Eleanor's chair and sat beside it without instruction. Eleanor put her hand on his head. "There," she said. "That's better." That evening, with 16 people either present or accounted for within the expanded network, Cutter said the thing he'd been building toward since the pharmacy. He said it after dinner, an actual meal, from consolidated supplies, which Priya had organized with a genuine chef's instinct she'd never mentioned having. He said it the way he said everything, flat, factual, without theater. "The military transmission I intercepted this afternoon says Cross and I have been working the scanner for 3 hours. He looked around the room. Brennan was there, quiet and practical, as logistically capable as advertised. Pollard was there, managing his anxiety in the specific way of someone who was winning a close argument with himself. Amara was there, Atlas at her feet, Eleanor in her chair. All of them our full, improbable collection. "The outbreak's vector," Cutter said. "The way it's spreading. I've been tracking the density maps on the scanner data. The movement reports from the few active military units still broadcasting. It's not random. What do you mean, not random? Marcus asked. His voice was careful in the way it got when he was about to receive information he'd rather not have but knew he needed. It's following the evacuation routes. Silence. The infected, whatever they're navigating by, they're following the highest concentration of prior human movement. The roads the convoys used, the corridors. He spread the map, his map, the more complete one. The northeast quadrant is dense because that's where the first convoys went. The secondary site, wherever the later convoys were redirected, that corridor will be dense by now. I understood what he was saying. I sat with it. The specific geography of my fear for Dara located itself on the map in front of me, and I read its coordinates. And I held them without collapsing, because collapsing was a response that wasn't available in a room with 16 people in it. The people in those convoys, Priya said carefully. They might have moved east through the heaviest concentration, Cutter confirmed. Yes. But they had military escort, Marcus said again. And again the room understood the limitation of that fact. And again no one said it. What we knew was this: the evacuation had not been the safety it was framed as. The infrastructure of mass movement had created the infrastructure of the threat's expansion. The military's convoys had not driven through safety. They had driven through a situation that was actively worsening in the direction they traveled. My refusal to board the convoy had not been wisdom. I want to be precise about this. I had refused for sentimental reasons, for the quality of morning light through an east window, for a garden I'd inherited and couldn't surrender. The outcome that I was here, functional, part of a growing network that had consolidated resources and people and was developing the operational sophistication to sustain itself through an unknown duration, was not a product of my judgment. It was a product of geography and chance, and other people's competence filling the gaps of my own. Dara had made the rational choice and walked into a corridor that was worse than the one she'd left. I had made the irrational choice and been protected by the very irrationality of it. This is not a lesson. I want to be explicit about that. There is no instruction in this sequence. The lesson you might extract that conventional wisdom fails in unconventional circumstances. That the individual's instinct sometimes outperforms the institution's directive is a lesson that also kills people. Most of the people who refused that convoy for bad reasons were dead. The fact that I wasn't was not evidence of my reasoning. It was evidence of the gap between choice and outcome that crisis creates, and that we consistently, disastrously misread as meaning. Cross looked at me from across the table. He'd been watching me process. "We'll find them," he said. Not as a promise. As a direction, the direction he intended to push the network, the coordination, the growing operational capacity of 16 people who were learning to survive as a coherent unit. I nodded. I believed him. Not because I had evidence for it. Because he was the kind of man who said things he intended to do. And I had 4 days of data to support that assessment. Outside, the rain had stopped. In the sudden quiet, Atlas lifted his head, listened to the street, and settled again. We had survived day 4. We were still learning what that meant. I've told this story in the present tense of memory, which means I survived long enough to have a past tense. Dara made it. She was at a redirected site 40 miles east, a school gymnasium, military managed, genuinely safe. I didn't know this for 11 more days. Those 11 days are the closest I've come to understanding what erosion means from the inside, not dramatic deterioration, but the slow wearing of a surface by something patient and constant. Holt made it too. He was in the primary facility at Greenvale, which had stabilized by the time its numbers were managed. We made contact through a network that Cutter built using a combination of scanner interceptions, messengers, and a radio amplifier that Brennan jury-rigged from salvaged components with a competence that confirmed every impression I'd formed of him. What I understand now, not then, not on day 4. But now is that the choice to stay was never the variable I thought it was. The variable was Garrett Cross and Marcus and Priya's medical training, and Eleanor's organized calm, and Cutter's 19 years of keeping people alive, and Amara and Atlas, who heard what we couldn't. I provided walls and a roofline, and the knowledge of a trellis system my father had built. That was enough. It doesn't mean the choice was right. It means that sometimes the wrong choice, made in a world that still contains the right people, arrives at a survivable destination through no virtue of its own. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still working on it.